2 minutes to the B or D at 42nd Street, and take the train to 125th. Walk 10 minutes and you'll find yourself in front of CUNY's Aaron Davis Hall. It was there on June 21st, 1990, only 4 months after he had been released from Robben Island, that Madiba arrived for a town hall with ABC News' Ted Koppel. The eyes of the world had been firmly fixed upon Madiba since he had emerged from prison that February, just as they had been for decades. Yet for the first time, he could look back and answer whether he was everything he had been made out to be. There were many interested in making clear that he was not. Koppel had disguised an ambush as a town hall. And the audience, as well as joining by satellite from South Africa, sat questioners he had pre-selected, each poised to attack and isolate Madiba. Ken Edelman, a conservative pundit who would later become one of the loudest advocates for the invasion of Iraq, interrogated Madiba on the relationship he held with world leaders that the United States considered foes. Madiba refused to take the bait, responding, "One of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies." Koos van der Merwe, a leader of the South African Conservative Party, lectured Madiba as if he was an unruly schoolboy, saying, "Leave the violent campaign alone, come and sit down, become a normal person and talk. And lastly, forget communism." Madiba smiled. Then in Afrikaans he replied, "I am happy to know you. I hope that one day we shall have the opportunity to discuss the affairs of our country." You can imagine how the rest of the 80 minutes unfolded. Again and again, Madiba was condescended to and painted as a terrorist, a violent extremist, an obstacle to peace. After each hostile question, Koppel twisted the knife, waiting to see if Madiba would bleed. And each time, Madiba answered the questions asked of him, calmly and slowly. And then an hour into the event, Koppel returned to a question about Madiba's support for the Palestinian cause. Did that solidarity, he asked, mean Madiba was willing to alienate the Jewish community? It was a question so contrived that Madiba had to ask Koppel what exactly he meant. It is also a question that frankly rings familiar, one that I have been asked in similar forms many times myself. Whether opposing Israeli war crimes and violations of international law somehow makes you hateful towards a people. Madiba refused the premise. Instead, he flipped it into a different kind of question, about whether a politics of universalism can exist if it is riddled with exceptions, whether any of us are free if some of us are not. Towards the end of his answer, he said, "You can call it being political or a moral question, but anybody who changes his principles depending on with whom he is dealing, that is not a man who can lead a nation." Hypocrisy, political convenience, these forces possess a gravitational pull. So often it is easier to make a concession, to relinquish a long-held belief, to abandon a principle, than to hold firm. That was true when the world asked Madiba to compromise on apartheid. It was true when many asked him to abandon the Palestinian struggle for freedom. And it remains true today. But in that moment, as Ted Koppel pressured him under bright lights, Madiba showed us the power of solidarity, universal and unyielding. Solidarity extended to all. Solidarity even when the injustice is contested. Solidarity even when there are many who seek to deny what you know to be true. Solidarity, as Pope Francis told us, is uncomfortable. Solidarity, as Madiba showed us for 95 years, is not just a value, it is a strategy. In his demand of solidarity from himself and from each of us, Madiba becomes more than a man, more than a messiah. He becomes a mirror. When we hear his refusal to abandon those with whom he shared common cause, do we recognize ourselves? When we hear his willingness to lose power before he loses himself, do we recognize ourselves? When we hear his devotion to solidarity, not as an abstract concept, but as a call to action, do we recognize ourselves? Or do we recognize only the version of Mandela that asks nothing of us? Too many do. I think of the Tories in the United Kingdom, who described Madiba upon his passing as a true global hero, despite having spent the 1980s opposing sanctions, opposing the ANC, opposing his release. I think of those at the highest levels of our federal government, who claimed to venerate Madiba, but kept him on terrorist watch lists until 2008, when he was 90 years old. I think of the jailers who abused Madiba, who left him with eyesight permanently damaged from working in a lime quarry without protection, and then still attended his funeral. I think of each of these people, each of these moments of hypocrisy, and I find myself at a loss. And then I remember Madiba, a man with the capacity to forgive, a man who extended solidarity to all. It was only through that solidarity that South Africa could envision a future different than the past. It is only through that solidarity that we can do the same. 3 days from now, the world will mark Nelson Mandela Day. Children in elementary schools will make presentations, world leaders will issue statements, and millions will come together to honor Madiba's legacy. We will mark Mandela Day here in New York City too. New Yorkers across the 5 boroughs will reflect on Madiba's endless march towards freedom. We will think of organizations like Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, or JFREJ, who came together for the first time the week of the Ted Koppel Town Hall to show, in fact, how many Jewish New Yorkers stood in solidarity with Madiba, and to hold a Shabbat service that raised $50,000 for the anti-apartheid struggle. And as we remember Madiba the man, some will ask ourselves a harder question. Who are we treating today the way Madiba was treated before history declared him a Messiah? For every kind word of praise we now use to describe Madiba, who is being described today the way Ted Koppel described him then? Who else has seen their humanity made conditional, has been told their freedom can wait? Who else is leading a cause that we will glorify in retrospect, but is being vilified in the present? Who else needs our solidarity? I think of Omar El Akkad, who wrote a book titled, "One Day, Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This." That sentence captures one of history's cruelest, most familiar habits. Eventually, almost everyone claims they opposed apartheid. Eventually, almost everyone claims they stood with Madiba, that they stood with Dr. King. Eventually, almost everyone will claim they oppose so much of the injustice that they justify today. But justice is not measured by where we stand after history has issued its verdict. It is measured by where we stand when the verdict is still being rendered. Why must we wait until 1,000 more parents bury their children? Until even more lose their limbs, their homes, their futures, to come together and insist upon Palestinian freedom? Why must Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya wait more than 18 months for freedom in Israeli detention? A detention that continues to this day, after the world watched him be kidnapped as he left his hospital, watched as he was wasting away in prison. Why must we wait as Umar Khalid enters his 6th year of captivity in Delhi, a political prisoner, jailed under the same manufactured charges of terrorism that were once leveled against Madiba? Why must we wait to stand steadfast alongside immigrants being targeted and preyed upon? Whether it was Joan Sebastian Guerrero, shot in the head by ICE in Biddeford, Maine on Monday, or Amaramiro Emmanuel and Ekpeyong Andrew, 2 Nigerians killed last week in South African streets where xenophobia builds. Why must we wait to practice solidarity until it no longer costs us anything? The responsibility of answering those questions honestly and fully rests upon each of us. It is a responsibility of drawing solidarity further into our lives, our politics, the way we walk through the world. This is no easy task. The world we live in is designed to pull us apart. Profit motives and algorithms are engineered to turn us against one another. The few with much exploit the many with little. We continue to reckon with genocide in Gaza and war across the globe. And as always, there is money to be made and power to be won in demonizing the poor and stoking the fires of racial animus. These are all forces designed to separate us from one another, to turn away from each other. But were these not the same conditions that Madiba overcame? When Madiba arrived on windswept Robben Island, his connection to the outside world severed.